thinking it bothers me.
Game's coming up.
I know it's.
Get away, get away. Good morning, Bob. It's a better morning for some than others. Though I tell you what, Bob, at several points last night, I thought Bob's yelling at the TV right now because your team didn't play as well as they could have. They probably did. And that's amazing. That's as good as you can do. But the offense had some struggles. Oh, really? Huh. He tried. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. They know the Aggie offense wasn't going to score. That defense needed to score. And it did once. Yeah. Oh, really? I heard last week they got hurt. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Well, win or lose, it's good to have the game back.
Yeah.
We went to Memorial Stadium for a game when I was in school down there one time. Yes, we did in our group. And more than that. So we were insane. We got there early, and stands kept filling in, and there was this big section behind us that didn't fill in. And we kept looking around, and in a minute, the band started coming in, and they put that Aggie band right behind us. It's like, oh, this is going to be a long game. But Erk Slavin was punting for him during that time. We got to see him kick like 70, 72 yards. He was a real good punter.
Yes, everyone here today.
Yeah.
Yo, you gotta leave it up in the morning?
Well, yeah, I did too. But that was at least 2 times I thought we'd score a touchdown and we didn't. So. Well, that's right. We're getting manhandled on the line, so let's just run it right into the line and see what happens. She was screaming at him.
Pretty much.
Gotta respect the elders. You all right, Lori? Doing good.
Oh, yeah. You'll get your chance.
See, I had your dad there yesterday. Morning.
Morning.
It is morning. I've pushed y'all back. Wow. So, no, that is fine. We got room for others. There's a song out there. So, we have more coming in. But yeah, we are in 1 Corinthians 10, about some portion of the way through. Maybe not a third of the way through. And of course, that's wrapping up that section 8 through 10. We'll get started with prayer, and then I'll do a little review. Thank you, kind and merciful Father, for the great gifts you give. You are very patient with us, very loving. You are kind to discipline us and grow us in your will, to make us like you in your holiness. We thank you for this kindness, Father, for your mindfulness of us. We just pray your gentleness with us, that you will remember our frame, that we are but dust. Thank you for loving us, Father, and for this assembly and the chance, of course, in classes to grow in you. We pray your help on all of us as we teach and listen and learn. Guide us in all your ways, Father. In Christ Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so before I get started, any questions up to now? Anything y'all been thinking about? You wake up in the middle of the night, like a cold sweat, and 1 Corinthians and chapter something. Anything like that? Of course, we're starting our third month. The last of the quarter, we have 5 weeks, including this week, so that's 10 classes. Has this been working? Or, you know, the format, just the means of going about it, the pacing, are y'all harvesting the fruit that you were hoping to get, or are there other things you're wanting to look at? Anything like that?
So far, so good.
Okay. Cool. But yeah, please don't hesitate. Don't be shy. Bring up any requests you have. That is my job, to learn this myself and then communicate it. So, chapters 8 through 10. Tell me what's going on here. What is the theme of this section?
Idolatry.
Yeah. Idolatry. What were the problems in Corinth with idolatry? Why is Paul having to address these things, especially after he was there and no doubt would have taught them some of this stuff?
It was very prevalent and just part of their daily lives.
Yeah, definitely. He had not been there in maybe a few years or so. He wrote this letter from Ephesus on his third missionary journey, I believe. And so, who knows what else had crept in, and of course, what new influences they get, new converts and so forth. Yeah, this was the life many of them were plucked from. And so in chapter 8, he starts out his approach is talking about, we have knowledge that there's one true God. Some people can't get away from that idolatry. And when they see you eating in an idol's temple, you may know that you're not worshiping an idol. They don't understand that. And then that can lead them to become, we're talking about ruining them, wounding their conscience, and so making them stumble. So Paul using multiple ways to describe the spiritual calamity that they enter into. How does chapter 9 fit into this section? It seems like a departure, but it's not. How would you say it fits in? Why does it belong in this nice little sandwich on idolatry and stuff?
Because they were accusing him of doing things, and he was explaining once again his credentials and the fact that he was, if he thought he was hindering anyone, that he would stop immediately, and had done so.
Yeah, no, definitely. In chapter 8, he mentions, if food causes my brother to stumble, I'll never eat meat again, so I will not cause my brother to stumble. Yeah, in chapter 9, he's talking about some of them seem to think, maybe from what some people gather, and some of the language Paul uses, seem to think that maybe some in the commentary world and the theological world today think that the Corinthians back then were accusing Paul of maybe a double standard, like, well, why are you telling us we can't eat in an idol's temple, yet you eat meat from the marketplace? And he'll address that at the end of chapter 10. And so Paul's like, don't we have a right to eat and drink? To the non-Jew, I became like a non-Jew. I forget what term he used for that. And so trying to show them that in some ways there are liberties that are okay to exercise, but in some ways there simply aren't. And they're not really a liberty to engage in. So he talked about foregoing his right to pay for the gospel. And of course people were examining him, some of the Corinthians. Even giving up pay, they would hold him in suspicion. So you can't win. You cannot win. He talks about disciplining his body, making it a slave, so that after I preach to others, I myself will not be disqualified. And then that's a great segue to chapter 10. So in chapter 10, how does Paul start out? He starts out by talking about, let's go back in time, let's go to the nation of Israel. And even though there were pagans in the audience, no doubt he had brought up his history with them, the history of his nation, because that, leads segues to Christ. And so he's like, consider them. They were all baptized into Moses. You had the cloud, you had the water on each side. They all ate the same spiritual foods, drank the same spiritual drink. So in those things, he's kind of showing them, just like you were baptized into Christ, so too, these Israelites, the people of God back then, were baptized into Moses, so to speak. Moses led them in the law. He gave them the law. Of course, it came from God ultimately. And so, just like that, and then he goes from there, like, despite all those things, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, verse 5, chapter 10, for they were laid low in the wilderness. And then the examples Paul uses are very relevant to the Corinthians. They committed idolatry, they committed sexual immorality, they complained against God and Moses, and he may not say that in those words, but when you go back and look, it's like they were grumbling against God and God's leader of the people. So what's the analogy? They did these things back then. What were the Corinthians doing? I feel so far away from them.
They were doing similar things, and he shows them examples what happened to the Israelites when they did these things, and God judged them, punished them.
Yeah, absolutely. They were apparently complaining against Paul. Why are you prohibiting us from eating the idol's temple, eating these cultic feasts, with our relatives on their property, these kind of ancestral worship feasts? Why are you prohibiting us from this? And, grumble, grumble, grumble. We want to do these things. It's our right. We have this knowledge. We want to do the things that we want to do instead of serving each other in love. And so, yeah, absolutely. Lori's getting all the points, y'all. Come on. I need the marker board here to get the leaderboard. So, but no, very great thoughts, Lori. Thank you. That is absolutely true. And so he ends that with saying, verse 12, let him who thinks he stands, you might think of the puffed up Corinthians, take heed lest that he does not fall. Verse 13, no temptation is overtaken you. I'm sorry, we actually weren't to that verse. But that's okay. I'll read 11 through 13. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. No temptation is overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. So he brings it home in verse 11. Example for them. Hint, hint. I'm talking to you. Of course, verse 6, he mentioned examples for us. So, that we would not crave evil things as they also crave, so that we would not. He brings that up in verse 11 there. So in verse 12, let him who thinks he stands. Think of the puffed up Corinthians. Think of them trusting in their own knowledge, their own, maybe, well, my spirit understands so my body can do what it wants. Things like that, things that we've already discussed. And verse 13, so no temptation has overtaken you. God is faithful, will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. What class of Christian does that verse not apply to? What kind of Christian engaged in what kind of activity? It does not apply to a certain type of Christian. So rebellious. It's those who don't care. Those who want to do what they want to do and who live in that life. Sorry, I know, kind of a vague, ambiguous question. But it doesn't apply to those who are just going to march on with their so-called liberties and who don't care about God's will. With the weak, with the struggling, yes, God will deliver. He will provide the way of escape. He will help us. We may not always see it. We may not always see it in hindsight, but He does deliver. Of course, in this context, he's talking about sins that lead to, destruction and separation from God. However, it all works with all kinds of sins and so forth. I don't know. But he's saying God's faithful. He'll deliver us to the end if we're trusting in Him, if we're walking in that way. But if the Corinthians didn't care, if they were rebellious, obviously this wouldn't apply to them. Okay, everybody good up to now? All right. Someone please read, it's a lot, it's 9 verses, but read 14 through 22.
beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves in what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything. Rather that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God, and I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?
Thank you. Okay, so he brings his main point home. If there was any confusion about what he was getting at with the Corinthians, now he's like, no, here's what I'm trying to tell you. Here's the practical side, just like he did in chapter 8 there. So he's gentle with them. He reaffirms his love. Therefore, my beloved, verse 14. He's not there to beat them over the head and to just drive them into submission. He reminds them along the way, like you're still, in a way, children to him. Not like in the, the priest and whatever today. I mean, he's talking about that he helped father that church. So he's gentle. He helps them. And look what he does. I speak as to wise men, verse 15. You judge what I say. It's kind of a departure from what he said in chapter 3. He's like, I have to give you milk and not solid food. You're thinking according to the flesh. Now he's like, okay, either because if they made it this far on the letter, they're either more understanding, or maybe he's just accommodating them because at this point he's like, okay, you understand these principles. I don't have to baby you. I don't have to wear the kid gloves. And so he helps guide them in that. Now when it talks about, we'll get to that in a moment actually. So it's not the cup of blessing which we bless, a sharing in the blood of Christ. It's not the bread which we break, a sharing in the body of Christ. There's one bread. Since there's one bread, we who are many are one body. We all partake of one bread. What is Paul saying? Is he prescribing, here's how you'll do communion, do it with one little loaf, and you'll do it with one cup? What is he saying in this passage?
We're all equal in observing the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
We're all Christians.
Yeah, it is a fellowship with each other, with God. The vertical aspect, us with God, and horizontal with each other. It's an idea of unity there. Because there's never a prescription on your church will be this big, your loaf must be this big, whatever. No, it doesn't seem to be the indication there of what he's getting at. And of course, it sets us apart from the rest of the world, right, Lori? Of course, we're together in this, and so we have all that sharing, and something which the outside world, the pagans, do not have, obviously, whether in their communions with their gods or whatever. Verse 18. So he talks about looking at the nation of Israel there. He's like, as what he just did at the start of this chapter, go back and consider them. They, those who eat the sacrifices, sharers in the altar. So the priests, they'd offer up some of the food, and then they'd take some for themselves there. They'd burn some, and some they would get to eat there. So even then, there's a communion. A communion in the sacrifices, perhaps a communion with the offerer of the sacrifice there. And so, a lot of food, as we talked about, a lot of food ideas going through here. But, of course, what do we think? If for those of y'all who had a Thanksgiving meal, I mean, you sat with people that you're close to, right? And you didn't talk about certain topics. Okay. And so you enjoyed each other's company, and you have a fellowship with each other, a common bond. And so, with that in mind, that's kind of the idea that food brings that fellowship. Welcome, welcome. We're going through 1 Corinthians 10 right now. And so, even in the back then, in the Jewish times, there was a fellowship, so to speak, there with the priests and the sacrifice and so forth. And so, Paul's leading up to something. He's showing that in all this, there's a heavy implication that there's this communion. There's communion for the Jews. There's communion for the Christians. So now, by way of extension, the pagans have their own sense of communion with their false gods, too. So verse 19, what do I mean? Things sacrificed to an idol is anything, or an idol is anything? No, he already addressed that in verse 8, or chapter 8 rather, that there's no such thing in this idolatry. But he's let these false gods there. He's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not going back on that word. The things the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons, not to God. I do not want you to become sharers in demons. So Paul's not saying that there's some demon out there named Zeus and that the Corinthians were Apollo or the other ones, Asclepius. You remember those ones from our first lesson, right? So any of those false gods. He's saying that it's demonic activity. Maybe there's demons behind these false gods, like motivating this idolatry. We don't know. Moses talked about the same thing in Deuteronomy. He's like, they sacrifice to demons, these pagans. So, of course, a complete slap in the face to them, worshiping their so-called gods. But it's not that knowledge is always enough. Sure, many of them knew that these gods were real, but Paul's like, even with that, you can't engage in these fellowship activities. Like, if you go to an idol's temple, you are sitting with a bunch of people who are there for the purpose of honoring their false god, as the priests, prepare the meat and so forth. Like, you can't be part of that. It doesn't matter if you know it's wrong or not. That is not a real liberty of yours. And do y'all have any thoughts on that up to this point, or questions or anything? Carol, yes.
What you do and how people see you matters.
Yeah.
And that's why when they went to sacrifice or went to the temple, whatever, people would see that fellowship that they're having, and that's what you're presenting to the world.
Okay. And in chapter 8, he takes it from the point of view of the brethren. It's like, look what you're doing to them. And here, yeah, it's like you're doing that with other pagans. And he's about to say that if a pagan tells you, you go to their private home, maybe this is meat sacrificed to idols, it's like, don't do it for their conscience sake. So, because we are presenting ourselves, and so we don't want them to think, oh, they worship one more god than we do. They worship our gods too, and we don't want to make the brethren fall into idolatry. So yeah, it's very important. So he hits it from the other angle here.
I think also that he emphasizes that there's only two camps.
Yeah.
Either you are with God and honoring God, or you are against him, which would be Satan.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's not a gray area, there's no in between. So you
Yeah.
have to consider that.
Absolutely. And they are there for the purpose of that idolatry. And so you can't do that. You can't, the cup of demons and the cup of the Lord and so forth, verse 21 there. So he's like, does not compute. Of course, he's using symbols here, right? The cup of the Lord, the table of the Lord. And so, yeah, he's showing that, of course, the same symbols that Christ laid out in the Lord's Supper there, and using that for the pagans and stuff, too. Sorry, I'm just catching myself up here. So, verse 22, this testing God, we already talked about that. We saw what happened to the Israelites in the first part of the chapter. And Paul's just like, no, you can't do that. You're not stronger than God. You can't win that fight. You can be puffed up. You can be self-assured. You cannot challenge and overcome the living God. So, a little quote from the Gordon Feast commentary. Surprise, surprise. He ends the discussion of this section with the following. In a variety of ways, this paragraph has continued to be a word for the church. Converts in third world settings, of course, and someone brought this up last time, I believe, or a couple times ago. Converts in third world settings, of course, often have an immediacy with it, this text, that many others do not, as they struggle over the religious intent of meals of various kinds, sometimes even in their ancestral homes, where the meal is eaten in honor of the god. What Paul is finally forbidding is a kind of relationship with the demonic. How that translates into modern Western cultures may be moot, as in, we may not relate to it. Probably what most Western Christians need to learn is that the demonic is not as remote as some of us would wish to believe. Being members of one body in Christ makes it quite impossible to be involved in idolatrous practices, what you were just getting at. Fundamental allegiance is at stake. One cannot serve God and mammon, or demons, whatever form they may take in our modern world. Sitting at the table and experiencing its benefits of grace and freedom, the table of the Lord that is, does not give one license for religious or moral licentiousness or looseness. Rather, it binds us to one another in common fellowship around Christ and the new covenant in such a way that our behavior in the new age is radicalized toward, quote, the law of Christ. So I think he wraps these things up quite well. I appreciate his wording on that. And Paul will have one brief section to finish up this whole set of chapters. Chapters by our standard, they didn't have chapters. Any questions on up to now with those idolatrous practices, anything like that? That was from his New International Commentary of the New Testament, First Epistle to the Corinthians. I'm on live. I probably should give credit, right? So I'll give one quick thing to y'all. If I go to eat in the Chinese restaurant and they have little Buddha statues there, is that the same thing as what Paul's talking about? Why or why not? You say no. You got something for me? Ken? Sorry, look at Ken behind me.
I'm just
Oh, yes, sir.
reading your lips.
Oh, okay. Well, hey, if you got something, please share, sir. So anyone who wants to speak to that, why or why not, is that the same thing?
I don't hear too good.
Yes, sir. I'll try and project. Try and be loud. That's why everyone moved back this morning. I'm just kidding. So.
Go, Ken, go.
I was just gonna say, that's not the intent of that building, that place, and what's going on there, that they do have evidence of that present, but the purpose of that building is to feed people food.
Yeah.
And the food that's in there was not sacrificed to idols,
Yeah, true.
to our knowledge, but.
Yeah, exactly. The guys in the back making probably minimum wage, whatever, right? They're not there to do that. Exactly. In this context, they actually had priests that would butcher the food, so at least at times. And so just one thing to note, it's easy to get our consciences worked up sometimes. And that, it's good to be sensitive, but not overly. So, yeah, you had the little red statue sitting there on the shelf next to you, whatever.
Okay, can I play the devil's advocate?
No pun intended, or pun intended? Okay, go ahead.
What about, like, when the church religious group over St. James religious group has a fish fry fundraiser?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
There's another church that has a stew cooking and stuff, and yeah, it's, of course, I would personally avoid it, and their purpose behind it is probably, I assume, just to gather people together and generate interest in spiritual things. I assume they're not offering it to God.
No, but they are using it as a fundraiser for their activities.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that I would definitely have a problem with that, and because the purpose is made clear, and so people gathering there. So I think it's a very good point. So if you have trouble, if you need to pay for a meal, ask me and I'll help you, but don't go there for the free food or the fundraiser or whatever. Good point. Don't think that would be, I think in line with this text, it'd not be appropriate. Because we don't want to support the practices that they engage in. Anyone else have thoughts on that?
Well, I think going back to this particular instance, that's what he's trying to get them to avoid, is participation in the idolatrous practice or the appearance of participation. And while our options, as Lori talked about, are not idolatrous in the same sense, they are certainly participation with that group in something we would not consider according to God's law.
Yeah.
And so it's almost a parallel in what Paul asked them not to do and what we are asked to do.
Yeah, yeah, no, great thought. So, okay. Someone please read 23 through 30. It's not that long.
All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edifying. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. If one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for conscience sake. I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks?
Thank you. Okay, so in a little different turn, and again, there are some today or in the modern era who, and I'm sure throughout time, who think that Paul would probably eat some of the meat, eat meat at the marketplace there, and so then they'll be like, well, why are you doing that? You know, and you prohibit us from eating at the idols temple. So Paul addresses that last subject and like, here's how this works. And it's hard to think that he didn't touch on that when he was with them, but he at least is bringing it up again. Now this is different. This is not talking about the eating in the idols temples, chapter 8, chapter 10. That's not what he's getting at. He's already addressed that. He's already been with that thoroughly. So he's not going back on that. He's not muddying the waters. He's talking about probably just private residents. Hey, you know, they're going to have me over at their house and serving meat, whatever. I don't know where it came from. I don't care. That's what he seems to be talking about. This is an area of freedom. So it is where there's liberty. And Paul's like, okay, here's how you can engage in that liberty. Yes, God gives you that freedom there. Again, something to be handled with love, not to be puffed up, you know, or whatever. Because the Corinthians were kind of concerned with their rights, so to speak. Paul was concerned with the love and freedom. As Fee puts it, Corinthians were concerned about their knowledge and rights, things which puff one up to a sense of entitlement. He says that Paul was concerned about love and freedom, two very different sides to that coin, things which build others up. So, 23 and 24. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. We've heard that before. Does anyone have it in quotes in their translation? Verse 23, sorry.
1 Corinthians 6?
Yes. Well, and in chapter 10. Is it in quotes in chapter 10 for y'all?
Oh, no.
That's interesting that they wouldn't. But he's quoting the exact same thing he said in chapter 6, right? All things are lawful. Well, tap the brakes. Let's examine that statement. Not all things are profitable, not all things edify. So whatever the Corinthians were thinking, they weren't viewing it from the aspect of loving God, loving neighbor. So here, now Paul, again, he's talking about eating meat, again, maybe just in someone's home, not for a cultic feast, but just private residence, it's whatever. It would be too hard to actually kind of reconcile that with what he just said in chapter 10 and chapter 8, if it was anything else. verse 26, for the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. That's a reference to Psalm 24. That verse, that quoted verse, if you go back and look at that psalm, don't do it, I'm just saying, if you did, that verse that he quotes abruptly transitions from talking about God's ownership of all creation to the fact that only the pure can be in fellowship with God. This is a lesson for Corinthians in righteousness. You're concerned about your freedoms, you're not concerned about walking in the righteousness of God there. So I don't think Paul was cherry-picking words. He was quoting it in a context, as we've seen before. So, meat, what's Paul saying? Pagans can't take this meat. It doesn't matter if it's been sacrificed to their false gods, the demons. It doesn't make a difference. It is God's meat. God is allowing them to eat it. Different story for the idols temple and those pagan practices. But here, he's like, they can't take that away from you. Can't take that away from God. And the conscience involved, he mentions that word a few times. He's talking about not your conscience. Your conscience should be clean in this regard. Instead, the conscience of the other person, you don't want that pagan to think that, oh, they're going to engage in idolatrous worship when I told them this meat's sacrificed to idols. He's like, in that case, you take your freedom and you walk out the door. So the origin of the food is a non-issue. So for the meat market, also called the Macellum, Gordon P. notes the following. The Macellum itself was one of the most prominent shops in the Roman and Greek marketplaces, as is evidenced especially by the ruins of Pompeii and supported by other excavations. It was, quote, a rectangular court of pillars with a fountain in the middle and over it, supported, just like Walmart, right? I'm kidding. With a fountain in the middle and over it, supported by the pillars, a dome-shaped roof, the booths on the sides, before them porticos. And that was from, he was actually referencing another work in the middle of his work from J. Schneider, Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. A Latin inscription of the Macellum in Corinth has been discovered, undoubtedly the very one Paul is referring to here. So isn't that cool? Don't you love those little throwbacks to history there? I do, so. And he goes on to state that, quote, what was sold in the Macellum often contained meat butchered by priests, much of it having been part of the pagan sacrifices. So maybe it was offered to their false gods, maybe not. To the Christian, it should not matter, because you weren't engaging in idolatrous worship or an idolatrous practice in a private residence just with the person. But if they told you it was sacrificed to idols, that's when you're like, you need to be careful for their conscience. Does that distinction make sense? I want to make sure we're clear with that, or else it's going to be a very confusing 8, 9, and 10. Okay. I'm sorry, go on. No, please interrupt. Bring your questions, thoughts.
Do you think he's also telling them that if you don't know, you won't be held accountable for it?
So in this specific context, it didn't matter because the earth is the Lord and its fullness and stuff. So even if they did know, now for things today, like, I mean, if I go eat, someone invites me over and then they're like, and they're like, hey, can you help pay for the food or whatever? I give them some money, like, hey, this is a donation for my church. Then it's like, oops. So, but I didn't know that. So I think there is culpability, or what's the word? I'm probably misusing that word, non-culpability, in senses of ignorance. Proverbs says, if a man says, see, we did not know this, does not God take it into account? Something to that effect. I think it's Proverbs 24:12. And so there's something to say about ignorance and acting ignorantly. I mean, in some situations, it does mention, I think Abimelech, when he was taking Sarah, was about to take in his wife. He's like, hey, I didn't know. I acted innocently. And God's like, I kept you from sinning against me. So sometimes it might be sin if we act in ignorance, sometimes not. The difference between those two, I don't know. If anyone else has thoughts, Ken, don't you say it. I'm kidding. Go ahead and say it.
I think you want me to say wisdom.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, pray for wisdom. Unfortunately, there's not always the black and white and stuff. If you have anything specific you want to talk about, we can talk about it. But
No, just in general.
Yeah, I think ignorance is an excuse in certain cases, but yeah, wisdom. Pray for wisdom, seek wisdom, talk with others.
So Dustin, an interesting thing there, in verse 28, as he kind of sums this, he says, "But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who told you." He turns the attention not from the participant's conscience, but for the sake of the person who's there. As if, so I'm just going to say it, even the knowledge isn't it's not aimed at you. If I know it's been offered to idols, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem for me.
Mm-hmm.
What it might be is a problem for the person who's offered it to me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
So then you just have to worry, well, how will this be perceived by others?
Yeah.
Like, I have the freedom to eat this, even though I know it's sacrificed to idols, but how will that be perceived by
Yeah,
others?
exactly. And that's the main issues of 8 and 10, right? If you do it, if you're in the idol's temple, what's it going to do to your brethren? They'll think idolatry is okay. If you do it in chapter 10, then the pagans around you, I think by implication, he doesn't say this explicitly, they'll think you're engaging in this idolatry. And you're just going through the rituals of idolatry anyway. You probably shouldn't do that. So yeah, it's outward looking, but there are certain things still prohibited for the individual. But this was a freedom, so. So in this sense, yeah, Paul's, actually it's the Lord, of course, permitting that eating with the pagans and so forth. The Christians can go eat with them, and what they put before you. Okay, so no, that's good discussion of that. Any more questions on that? I want to make sure we're clear, because I know it can sound like we're going kind of back and forth, but there's separate context here.
Dustin, I'll just point out, every now and then it's beneficial. I run two versions right next to each other in my Bible, and the one on the right is the Young's literal translation,
Yeah.
where he translates each word or phrase literally. And that verse 32 where it says, "Do not offend Jews or Greeks or the church of God." In his literal translation, it's a little bit different. It says that the verb tenses actually indicate that what's being said there is become offenseless,
Interesting.
both to Jews and Greeks in the assembly of God, which calls to mind other verses about being above reproach,
Yeah.
which matches more what we just talked about, rather than specifically trying to not offend others. Instead, the verb tense indicates that we're supposed to be working on ourselves, that we can become offensive,
That's
so
interesting.
that others do not perceive us in ways that would bring shame to God.
Yeah. So in the Greek, I know Clippy, that's our spell. I know Clippy will often yell at you for using the passive tense. The Greek make heavy use of that book called the middle and the passive tense. So as we talked about, those verbs that reflect back on you. And so some of it can actually go in that direction. And sometimes they have verb for things that we don't. I was going through 1 Corinthians 13 yesterday, the love chapter, and so it says love is patient. They actually have a verb that's a kind of a love patiences, so to speak. I mean, it can take different forms. Love has patience, whatever.
But it kind of personifies it.
Yeah, it's just they verbify words that we use kind of equative or like is and has or possessive verbs and stuff like that. So yeah, it's just a little bit different there. And so there's the passive verbs, there's other forms. So Greek, it's not always one for one. It's not memorized vocabulary, plug and chug, you're a Greek scholar. No, I'm not a Greek scholar either. But the thing is, as you learn it, you learn which books to go to, and they tell you lots of things that you can't figure out, because they look at all the different, they look at the biblical manuscripts, they look at the writings in that time period that used Koine Greek. And so they leverage lots of resources, like here's how Greek works. But yeah, that's interesting. So no, I didn't go back. Please don't think I'm going through the Greek on all this. I'm definitely not. I couldn't read it that fast anyway. And it would take forever to go through the material on it. But no, that is interesting to know. Let's wrap up chapter 10 with this, and then we can probably no time for 11. So 28, let's see. You read through 30. I'm already in chapter 11, my bad. I just flipped the page. So we talked about that. And of course, Paul talks about Thanksgiving in verse 30 there. And that's important. So our freedom to eat comes with, of course, abundant thanks to God. 1 Timothy 4:3 says, men who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods which God has created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. So that verse is not talking about this context, but the thankfulness is what I want to bring out there. Fellowship with demons and their worshipers is not something Christians partake in. That's not, even if you're thankful, you can't. No. So we beat that horse. All right, let's finish up. 31. Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many, so that they may be saved. This echoes lots of things. It ties up 8 through 10 very nicely. Instead of my rights, my liberties, it's how do I serve others in love? How do I honor God in love? How do I keep from giving offense to the pagans, the Jews, whoever, fellow Christians? And by giving offense, it doesn't mean doing something they don't like. It means leading them into a perverse state of conscience, a wrong state of conscience. That's the idea. You're leading them into sin or to believing that these evil things are okay. Of course, and just like in chapter 9, he does all things so that he can become a partaker of the gospel, and he so I might by all means save some. Now he brings it back, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many, so that they may be saved. And of course, that's verse 31, doing all to the glory of God. What does that mean? It's honoring God by our loving service, by our conduct, by our concern for others and the lost, and so forth. And then chapter 11, verse 1, there's your bonus verse, because that probably should have been with chapter 10. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. That goes back to chapter 4. He says that same thing. He urges the Corinthians to consider the example that he set. As he goes on at length in chapter 9, he lays that out, and they would have remembered him, of course. The ones who had known him back when he was first there. And so, yeah, he's like, be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Any questions? Great comments and discussions. Appreciate y'all very much. Thank you for reading. And, of course, we get the head coverings and the Lord's Supper and all that stuff next time. 6 chapters, 9 classes to go. So we might have to hurry, but that's okay. Chapter 12 should be short.